Commodore Peter Scott had a decorated 34-year career in 10 submarines, and he passed the most demanding military command course in the world and served as the head of profession of the Royal Australian Navy's elite, the Submarine Arm. During that time, his character was forged by the challenges of naval service, success and failure as a leader, and life-threatening traumas. Along the way, he also endured personal battles with self-doubt, addiction, depression and anxiety. Peter, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Jess. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you. I thoroughly enjoyed your book. When did it come out?
So April last year, so about a year and a half ago now. Yeah.
Right. Okay. What prompted you to write it?
So the book is fundamentally a memoir and covers my naval career, but specifically that submarine element of my career. And I think I'd long known that submarines as a capability are not well understood, and they can be really easily misunderstood, and it's quite hard to imagine what life in the Navy or certainly submarines might be like. So for me, it's a very normal life. It's just the way I've existed professionally over many, many years. But for most Australians, it's I know quite an exotic and really hard to comprehend way of living. So I wanted to offer people a bit of insight into what it's like to live that life, what it takes to do it, and really to do it well, and also what it means for Australian servicewomen and men to serve in the Navy and to serve in submarines. Yeah, so really it's about offering insight into that pretty unique way of living.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, talk about transporting people to another world. I felt, I sort of physically recoil because I get claustrophobia. Right. And on the Great Barrier Reef, you can go into those tiny little things and look at the fish, and that was enough for me. And I thought, wow, to dedicate your life to this with combat, it was just incredible. I mean, you feel at ease underwater in small confines, don't you?
Yeah. I think we ensure that we know and understand the risks that surround us, and we know and understand our submarine and the environment well enough to be able to deal with those risks and do the job. Yeah.
But absolutely, this is no cakewalk. It comes across really clearly in your book. It begins with a terrifying scene, and throughout there's some incredibly close shaves. We almost hit the bottom of the ocean.
Well, we hit the bottom at one stage, yeah. So
wow. So you got the idea, and I'm sure people said to you at dinner parties, you should write a book. You get the idea, but did it seem an ambitious project to execute?
It did and it didn't. In one sense, I thought, what I'm looking to do is tell something of my story. It's my story. It's all there. I can pull it out and write it down. The difficulty with that approach was that I totally underestimated the amount of work that was required in writing a book and finding a publisher and getting the book published and so on. So in one sense, it seemed quite simple at the outset. The more I got into it, so I recall a conversation with my wife saying, hey, look, I need 3 months. I want to write this book. And she said, I'll give you 6. I went, okay. I took the 6. But it was a year before I had a manuscript and a publisher. It was, 21 months before we'd finished the editing. And I think it was 27 months from when I seriously started to when the book was actually on the shelf.
27 months, so 2 and a bit years.
Yeah. And in that, lots of vacillation around, I've got a couple of stories. Does that mean I've got a book? Is the book, worth anything to anyone? And just sort of working through, the uncertainty and the doubt pretty much day by day as you go through that.
I think it's like starting a business. No one would start one if we knew ahead of time how much work it would involve.
Right. Yep.
And how stressful things could become. Now, you say at the start of your book that it is not the entire truth, that to tell the entire truth would put the safety of your fellow submariners at risk. Was it hard to select the anecdotes that you could share? And was there some actual self-censorship as well?
Yeah, so there was definitely self-censorship of the stories I would share, and what aspects of those stories I would share. I think that not the entire truth piece comes back to the single greatest asset or characteristic of submarines is their stealth. Their ability to go out to sea and operate undetected. We talk about, I write in the book about us being able to see without being seen, hear without being heard, and know without being known. And when you can do that, then you can control the environment, you can impact the environment, you can attack a ship if that's what you need to do, and so on. But that preservation of stealth kind of starts, at ground level. People not talking on a daily basis about what they do, what their submarines' capabilities are, and so on, and go all the way up to some really strict systems to protect classified material and advice and so on. So really important that I wanted to tell the story and help people see something of this life and understand something of the capability, but there was no point in overstepping the mark and offering precise details about where we might have been or what we might have been doing and so on. Yeah,
of course. I mean, this is Australia's security, that
right.
Defence and everything. I mean, there could be terrible repercussions if you were to be a renegade, and I mean, I'm sure that people would come for you as well.
Yeah.
Just simply not possible. But I am just fascinated. What you can tell us, of course, in the context of this, what you can tell me in response. When you had the idea and you wanted to begin the project, did you have to have some conversations with?
Yeah, and well, whether I had to or not, I certainly did. As I left the Navy, so I left the Navy full time back in 2017, and I had it in my mind that at some stage I might write a book. Now, it took me quite a few years to get to it, but I had conversations with the Chief of Navy at the time and said, hey, I'd like to tell something of this story, and successive Chiefs of Navy, lots of encouragement. Great idea, Scotty. People need to know more about our submarines and our submariners. You're the guy to tell the story. Get on and do it. So I think they were able to offer that encouragement because they knew that, I had been, in my last role in the Navy, I was kind of the top of the heap in the submarine world, and through my whole career, I'd been protecting what needed to be protected and so on. So it wasn't a big shift for me to go from never talking to anyone about any aspect of my work, pretty much, to, hey, I'm going to be telling a story, I'm going to be getting up on stages, and I'm going to be selling the book. And it was quite a shift.
Natural progression for you.
Yeah. Did you say natural progression?
Natural progression.
It was not a natural progression. I felt it was quite unnatural, and I had to sort of work hard to sort of take on that new persona of being an author and being a speaker and talking about aspects of that life. Yeah.
But I guess I was referring to you were in a leadership role, and this is, again, you are presenting, the voice, you are representing the Navy. But as I was reading your book, I just thought, I could imagine, like, I don't know if there's even a communications and marketing team, and Commodore Scott wants to write a book and their furrowed brows. Why does he have a writerly intent?
Yeah. So certainly, once I had a manuscript, and a publisher, that was when I sent the manuscript into Navy and said, hey, I'm in contract. This will be published. You need to let me know if there's anything that you want removed or whatever. And my fundamental concern there was, I thought I'd walked the line pretty well, but I didn't want anything appearing in the book that they were concerned would be breaching operational security or whatever. Now, I think they actually looked at it through a few different lenses. They looked at it through, how's the political class going to respond to this? What are the potential implications on reputation of the Navy and so on? So they had a pretty good, long, hard look at it. But at the end of the day, said, there was nothing in there that needed to be redacted or whatever.
Wow, that's amazing. Did you work with an editor or book coach in planning your book? You were with the expert author community, I think?
Yeah. So Kelly Irving, just fantastic, and the whole community that she sort of built, fantastic. So I hooked up with, that might be the wrong term, but started working with Kelly right at the start, just in January 21.
Yep.
And so she did a lot of sort of really broad structural editing for me in the very first instance, helped me build my publisher's pitch at one stage, which was really about me understanding the book that I was writing.
Yeah.
And that in itself took a couple of months to sort of really get a handle on that. Pardon me. But also the other tremendous benefit of working with Kelly was just a sense of community. We're online every fortnight with a bunch of other people who were authors or aspiring authors. She's got a great network of industry professionals who can talk to you about self-publishing or editing or marketing or whatever it is that you're interested in. And of course, along the journey, you're interested in all of it. So so that was fantastic. And once I started working with Fremantle Press, Rachel Hanson was my editor. She was just brilliant. I think the way I describe it is, I had a manuscript. There are a bunch of stories in there. The stories themselves didn't change for me. They were still my stories. But for the reader, it was pretty much a transformation. The whole thing became much more readable, much more impactful, and so on. And
it has to be accessible, doesn't it? Yeah. For the reader. Yeah.
And she was great at. So part of my challenge was, because it is such a specific life. There's all sorts of cultural norms, there's a language, there's technology, that when you're in that world, eventually it all becomes second nature. But outside of that world, it's rubbish. It makes no sense to anyone. So I had to write a book that would make sense to my submarine colleagues.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't laugh me out of town. But also that, your mum or your dad could pick up and read and make enough sense of it to, take something away from it. And that I found quite challenging. But Rachel was really good at just saying, hey, look, I don't understand this. What are you saying? And often those sort of sidebar conversations with Rachel, where I was explaining it to her or talking her through it, I'd realise, that's the thing that is an inbuilt assumption for me that I need to actually make explicit for the reader, or it doesn't make sense.
The terms were fascinating. Just familiar words, but unfamiliar context, like the use of piloting and stuff.
Yep.
But I loved hearing action stations because unbeknownst to me, in my family, we've said action stations forever. And come on, Mum will say, come on, action stations. So I was like, that's the origin, right?
Yeah.
And the other, there were many stations. When it's a bad situation?
Yeah, so that would be, you'd go to emergency stations.
Emergency stations.
So that's all about, setting up the submarine and the people in the right state for whatever it is that you're going to have to deal with. So we would go to harbour stations, and everyone on the submarine would have a particular harbour station, which would, set up the submarine and set up the people so that you could unberth from a wharf and navigate through a harbour and do all that. Emergency stations, if you suffer a flood or a fire or a hydraulic burst or an electrical failure or anything else, you'd go to emergency stations, and that puts you in a position where you can deal with those issues, or puts you in the best position to deal with those. Action stations, of course, is more combat related. So if you know you're going into a situation where you're at risk of, being counterattacked, or where you intend attacking a ship or a submarine, you'd go to action stations. Yeah.
I was watching Kath and Kim the other night, and Kel said action stations. And I said, okay, it's not just my family; it's entered the Aussie vernacular.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny. Could you tell us about one of the scariest incidents that are described in your book, just to give our viewers like a flavour of your life?
Sure. So the one that pops most quickly to mind is a flood that we suffered when I was in command of Deshano. So she's one of the Collins class submarines. We were at sea off Western Australia. We were dived. We were at what we call our deep diving depth. So if you think about the red line on a car's engine, you can go beyond that, but you're really pushing your luck. So we're down as deep as we would ordinarily go, and we're in a very deep piece of water. It was a pretty average kind of day until a pipe in the lower motor room burst, and that led to the submarine flooding at the rate of a tonne a second. So every second there was a tonne of seawater coming into the boat.
And how deep, when you say a deep part of the ocean?
The ocean was about 3,500 metres deep, so 3.5 kilometres deep. So, when a flood like that occurs, everything changes. You go from knowing and understanding the state of your submarine in intimate detail, you just know every nut and bolt, to endless questions. The one thing that we knew was that we had to get the boat back to the surface and stay there, because certainly if we'd gone down in that depth of water, the boat just would have been crushed before we hit the bottom.
Extraordinary. Because I was also thinking of the terrible situation, with the billionaire and his son who died last year around the same time, and how terrifying that must have been. Could you also tell readers about what living quarters are like? You had quite spacious quarters, didn't you? But how cramped do things get in a submarine?
Yeah, so in command, I had relatively spacious quarters. So what I'd say is that the submarines really are designed about efficiency and effectiveness. They're jam-packed with all sorts of cabling, machinery, computer systems, and so on. So they can, to the uninitiated, just appear as a tangle of pipes and wiring and machinery. Once you get to know and understand how all those systems come together, it kind of makes sense. But kind of the last things that get squeezed in there are the people. So accommodation is sparse. Typically you've got a bunk space, and that's about the only space that's private and yours on the submarine. depending on how many people you've got on the submarine, some people might have to actually share a bunk. So, while one person's on watch, the other person's in that bunk sort of thing. That's not typical, but
was there any recreation spaces?
So there's what we'd call messes. So there's a wardroom mess. So that's where the officers would, have their meals. But it's also where they would, do their work when they're not on watch in the control room and so on. And if you think, very cramped caravan with a large family, that's
in
kind
permanent darkness.
Well, not darkness. I mean, we've got lighting, but certainly there's no windows. There's no view out to the wider world. So look, it's fundamentally an uncomfortable and distasteful way to live. But why do people do it? People do it because there's a real sense of purpose built within the crews. People know why they're out there and what they're going after. It is challenging. It's not just challenging for the discomfort. Knowing and understanding that submarine well enough, knowing and understanding the environment that you're working in, that can be really challenging. They're super complex beasts.
High stakes.
High stakes, in peacetime, absolutely high stakes in wartime. But also the people, it's an entirely volunteer service. So, people might leave school and say, I want to do something different. I'm going to join the Navy. They then make another decision. Hey, I want to do something different again. I'm going to join submarines. So they tend to be people who are driven by purpose, are happy and willing and looking for challenge, can live and work in those sorts of environments and still tolerate the people around them and work well together and generate really some incredibly high performance, super specialised teams doing, very particular work.
And you also had prolonged absences from your wife and daughter, which you convey very strongly how difficult that was. That must be a really difficult dimension of it. How long did you go at some points without being able to communicate?
So without being able to communicate at all, up to 7 or 8 weeks. So the times you'd spend at sea would vary a lot, depending on what you're doing. Sometimes, you might literally just go out for a day, do some activity and come back in. You might be out for a couple of weeks worth of exercise. But also the boats will routinely deploy for, maybe 6 or 7 or longer months. And in that time, they might have a number of port visits, somewhere through Southeast Asia or something. But in between, they're spending, periods of weeks and or months at sea. And classically, just to go back to that stealth piece, one of the fundamental ways that a submarine operates is passively. So if you think about a warship, they operate quite actively. They're transmitting on radars and sonars. They're transmitting on radios. And all of that can be picked up and detected and tracked and so on. So the submarines operate quite passively. And one of the implications of that is we can receive lots of communications from our headquarters and so on. But depending on the tactical situation, we might not be transmitting anything at all. So that really does limit, connection and communication with home and so on. So classically, you go if you went to sea for 8 weeks, and you're conducting some serious work, there wouldn't be any communication with home in that time.
In writing a memoir, authors often you have to make a decision. Where do you draw a line in the sand with, sharing my whole self in my book and telling my full story, and that being the point of all the sweat and tears of writing a book? Was there any torment for you in there is the pressure not to reveal any state secrets or, any operational things that are sensitive, which is basically everything, and giving your whole self to the reader And are you happy with the balance that you struck?
I'm happy with the balance that I struck. To be honest, I never really felt that, don't tell any secrets thing as a pressure. It was, that was quite simple for me. I had to think about, how I might include some aspects of story and make sure that I wasn't unwittingly giving something away that I shouldn't.
Yeah.
But I didn't see that as a pressure. I just saw that as a responsibility that I was quite happy to take on. The bit about how much of yourself you might show, that was a challenge. I think at some stage, I decided that I didn't want to tell half a story. I didn't want to tell a story that was, all sunshine and roses.
Yeah.
Yes, I want to inspire other people to join Australian Submarines and live that sort of career, but also I wanted people to have a really good, honest understanding of what was involved, literally warts and all. But clearly there are some limits on what you might usefully introduce. So I just kind of used, my intent as my guide there. My intent was to write something that would help people see and understand submarines, honour the submarine arm and the people I'd worked with for all that time. And if in telling a story, I could see that it was useful for the reader in some way and it met that intent, then, I'd think it was worthwhile telling. Now, that said, Rachel Hanson, my editor, was brilliant at spotting the bits where, she was able to say, "Hey, I don't understand this, can you explain it?" But she also seemed to be able to put a finger on the bits where I'd told as much of a story as I thought I wanted to, but she'd sort of needle me and say, "I reckon there's something more going on here. What's going on?" And often I didn't even really realise that I'd put an arbitrary sort of limit on myself.
That's amazing.
Yeah, but when she asked those questions, I had to sort of front up and sometimes I did let more out, and sometimes I didn't.
I mean, as a reader, when you first go into, you're drinking a lot and you crashed a car or something as a youth, it was a youthful, foible. And I thought, this person is interesting because you were not one-dimensional and that you were giving, I felt, we're getting all of you or a lot of you. And
Right.
As a character, I thought, I want to know, where is this life going to end up? And
Right.
you could come across as too perfect. You're so highly decorated. You're obviously incredibly intelligent to handle this complex stuff. Resilient, the resilient mind that can withstand the pressure quite literally.
Yeah.
And so I really liked that about you because it became relatable,
Right.
to my life. Otherwise, you and I have nothing in common. So I don't know if other people have said that, but that was my kind of takeaway. So what would your advice be to a writer? So often it's our story, but it's not our story to tell. Yeah. Someone who, they've had a really fascinating, experience in a job or something, but they do need to manage what is confidential and what is not. You seem to have done well at that.
Yeah, so I think for me, again, it just came back to my overarching intent. And I found if I was, there's only a couple of instances where I tell a story that I didn't directly experience. But when I do that, I think I tell the story about how I did later have connection or experience of that. So I was conscious that I wanted to write my story, not everybody's story. And I certainly didn't, I was in I was absolutely determined not to dishonour anybody in telling my story, certainly unnecessarily. So, yeah, I think they were the things that guided me. Why are you writing the book? Does telling this story serve that purpose? Does it dishonour or discredit anybody unnecessarily? And what's in it for the reader? And I did find, again, a couple of those questions from the editor, you know, why are you telling this story? And I'd kind of realised I just had to get it out of my system. It didn't have to go in the book. You know, so there was a bit of stuff that was in the early versions of the book that was literally just me getting it out of the system, but I couldn't then find a connection to the reader.
Yeah. If it interrupts the flow or it prevents it being a page turner, then it has to go. Yeah. And in the blurb, it references addiction, and you're frank throughout the book about drinking a lot. I wondered whether you hesitated to include that at first, because I know a lot of my book coaching clients and myself, as a former heavy drinker, have been, how do I want to be perceived? Do I want to perceive myself in my book as having won at life?
Yeah.
How did you strike a balance with that on a personal level? And while also, again, having such a senior position in the Navy and also being frank about excessive drinking?
Yeah. So it's a good question. One of the things I've kind of realised is that sometimes the way that question is asked is, hey, you admit to a lot of heavy drinking, or you admit to this failing, or you admit to that failing. And I've realised that that word admit is the wrong word, because it's associated with guilt. You know, people make an admission of guilt. And what I kind of realised, you know, certainly in writing the book, probably over time, was that it was more a matter of acceptance. You know, I accept that I was a bloody idiot when I was 20 years old. I accept that I was a drunkard when I was 30. I accept this and I accept that. It's who I was at the time. So when you can accept that, then you can write it and you can share it, because it's not a matter of guilt or shame. It's just who I was at the time, and you know, we're all pretty complex beings. You know, these are just single dimensions, but that's how I probably explain it. Is that I came in writing the book to a much fuller acceptance of who I'd been at different stages of my life. And that made it easier to write about those aspects of my life.
That's a wonderful byproduct of writing a book. I just have two more questions for you. First is, do you miss being at sea?
Yes and no. So I absolutely miss, you know, the singularity of purpose and teamwork and the super high functioning, you know, teams and work and stuff that you can do. I miss that. I miss some of the sort of grandeur of being at sea, just the majesty of being at sea. But I think on the other side, one is, you know, I work now as an executive coach and do leadership development and so on. So that kind of scratches that itch of working with people and focusing on performance and so on. I do a lot of trail running, so I like to. That's kind of my way of getting out into nature and finding a bit of freedom and all that sort of stuff now. So, and perhaps the other aspect is I did so much sea time. You know, I don't need to go back and do any more.
Yeah. My uncle was in the Navy, and when he left the Navy, he went off when he was 16 as well. But he had boats and he used to sail from Sydney to Townsville every winter.
Oh,
so
right.
maintained his sea legs. So I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
wondered, because you're a sea person, you know, we're fire, water or land, and you're a water person.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
I certainly do enjoy getting out on the harbour and going sailing every now and again, but I don't have a habit of it like that. Sounds great.
Now, what have been some of the most effective marketing opportunities you've had with your book? Because authors are always hungry to learn what they can do better.
Yeah, so I'm not, I think, particularly driven by sales on this.
Yeah.
You know, I want the book to be read. I want that sort of word to get out. But I'm not measuring my success by how many books get sold every month. So I don't have a great track on what's the most effective marketing piece. I think fundamentally what I've aimed to do was, there's a natural market for me in the defence sector, you know, serving personnel, retired personnel, defence industry. So I've tried to sort of focus on that, you know, and hitting that market in the first instance. And then hopefully, you know, some of the interest will sort of bleed out and beyond that. So I think actually LinkedIn, funnily enough, has been really good for me in just sort of spreading that word out to that sort of, you know, handful of thousands of people, and so on. I think, you know, my team, Prio Press, have done what they can from a marketing perspective. Probably the only thing that I still sort of regret is that we haven't been able to get it into the airports. I think if we were able to get it into the airports, I honestly believe it's the sort of book that people would walk past and catch their eye, and you know, maybe 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 100 would go, oh wow, that'd be interesting, and pick it up off the shelf. But it's that sort of.
So what was how the airport bookstore? This is the holy grail, I think, for many authors. Did you approach Fremantle Press? Approach them? Did they?
Well, so they went through their distribution agents. Yeah. But we didn't land there, so.
Yeah, it's I guess it's limited floor space, isn't it? They have a certain number of meters. Yeah. All right. Well, that has been fascinating. Thank you so much for coming to talk about Running Deep. It's been a pleasure and an honour to learn about your world undersea.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for your time, Jess. Much appreciated.